a lot of that was about channels of communication.
Yep.
Right. Right. So how does that tie into what we're now learning about some of the efficiencies of decentralized versus centralized systems? And I think like a self-autonomous work group that is not always having to get orders from and ask approval from a higher level that is getting on with stuff, and then another group that's getting on with stuff, and another group getting on with stuff. That is a similar way that a military is becoming less top down. That we're not having to like answer to the general. And
it's not for nothing. Yeah, it's not for nothing that I keep going back to that example, because that kind of decentralized nature, it was coined by a general from the U.S. who I believe he led the surge in Iraq in 2009, and I might be misquoting his career, so I really hope I'm not, but General Stanley McChrystal, and he wrote a book called Team of Teams. And what he describes is in Iraq, in 2009, there was a resurgence of something. At the time, it was called AQI, or Al Qaeda in Iraq. And they were the precursor to, the group that later became, the Islamic State. Yeah, yep. So at that time, the US and, its allies were struggling to combat this threat because the threat itself was so decentralized. What it was, all of these Iraqi generals who went off with these kind of splinter groups of extremists and then took their expertise to these little local groups, coordinated on this aligned interest between them, and then operated independently and opportunistically to strike the coalition forces wherever possible. So it was virtually impossible to combat this because the threat arose, depending on the situation. So, at first it was, and the story that he quotes was actually, American forces dealing with this, this massive wave of attacks that they, again, it was just chaos, like in the streets for an afternoon, and, nobody had any idea where the threat was coming from. So his approach to this was to do exactly that. So in Western militaries, and you can contrast that with old Soviet doctrine, which is still present in the Russian military today, but that kind of top-down structure, Western militaries feature something called a non-commissioned officer corps, which are like the sergeants and the ones leading the platoons. They're the ones that he essentially tasks with, okay, your role now is you're going to gather intelligence in your area, you're going to be the liaison, we're going to rotate you through multiple different kind of military modalities so that you learn how things like the artillery forces work, how close air support works. So you have all of these tools in your tool chest that you can now use effectively, rather than calling and asking permission of the chain of command. So what ended up happening was these smaller groups started doing exactly that. They'd go out into the communities, gather intelligence, and would start to kind of outpace, the attacks, because they'd start to learn about them preemptively. They'd integrate with the communities, and they would do what the chain of command wasn't able to do because it was still in Washington and London, wherever. And it worked very well. And he wrote a book on this and described, in very rich detail, the mechanisms of it and how it actually unfolded in combat, like, in a theater where this happened. And this is very much happening again today across the world. I mean, it's still in the Middle East, the U.S. is I don't know if the fighting is the right verb anymore, or, engaged in some manner in Iran, which is using asymmetric, means of which to attack. So they're using these kind of smaller, cheaper alternatives. Again, Ukraine is another example where you've got non-commissioned officer corps that form this thick layer and are the ones that are actually carrying out these spectacular attacks that you're seeing across, happen across the front line right now. So it's a completely different model, I think, and there's actually a lot more documentation than people realize for it. It's just it hasn't made its way over to the corporate world, because everyone in the corporate world still has this like misguided idea that militaries are inefficient, because again, the politicians that hold the power of the purse are wildly inefficient about how they, implement and manage these programs. And the American Navy is a brilliant example of that.
Well, our friend Bob Emiliani, if you're listening, Bob, I don't know, in the future maybe, his theory is that our leadership are not incentivized to change. Because
absolutely not, no.
Their pay structure, everything, their bonuses, their pensions are all based on, let's keep the status quo. So, but the drastic change in military operations is like a metaphor for how businesses are going to have to change. And obviously when you start getting hammered by drones or you start losing, then it's obvious you have to do something about it.
Your big initiative and your big strategy all of a sudden has to scope down to the immediate threat, which is a $500 Mavic drone.
Exactly. And a business might fail from like a million paper cuts, but it's going to take 10 years for them to realize, and then it's too late. But if anything, the Iran America military operations, I think they call it, would be in 6 months it's sort of changed the way people think of warfare.
Again, I think it's like a $10,000 drone took out a multi-million-dollar radar array.
yeah